Naperville, Illinois, late autumn 2022. The trees had already shed most of their leaves, leaving the yards and sidewalks littered with dry, crumbling reminders of the season. John Miller, at 68 years old, walked slowly along the wooden porch of the house that had cost him most of his back strength, his knees, and several decades of his life. It wasn't a mansion, not even close, but it was his legacy. He had poured every ounce of energy into building it when his son David first married. Every brick in the chimney, every plank in the floorboards, every nail in the roof carried his signature. He had built houses for other families during his working years, but this one he had built with his bare hands for his own. In the suburbs of Chicago, this house stood as a modest fortress of what John thought was family loyalty. Back when he was younger, John had promised himself that his children would never have to live in cramped apartments like he did with his parents. Growing up in a two-room flat above a laundromat in Cicero, he had learned the value of space and stability. He became a builder because he believed that a man could secure his family's future not through words but through foundations and walls. The house in Naperville was not merely a roof over their heads, it was a symbol of that promise fulfilled. When he handed the keys to David and his new bride Monica, he felt proud in a way he never did even when finishing large projects for clients. It was his blood and sweat standing there in timber and stone. At first, things seemed to go as he had dreamed. Holidays were spent together, laughter filled the living room, and the smell of Monica's Sunday roasts became part of the rhythm of the house. But over the years the warmth began to thin out. David had climbed quickly in his corporate career, making more money than John had ever earned in his life. That success seemed to change him. He began looking at his father not as a figure to respect but as a leftover piece of the past taking up space. Monica's smiles grew colder, her eyes flickered with impatience whenever John settled into his armchair by the fireplace. It was the same chair he had carved the frame for, the same hearth he had built with bricks laid one by one after long shifts, yet suddenly he was treated as a guest in his own creation. John noticed small things first. His tools, which he kept neatly arranged in the shed, were moved without asking. He heard Monica whispering to David in the kitchen late at night, their voices low but their tones sharp. They stopped inviting him to family outings. Eventually, even the grandchildren began spending less time with him, as if instructed not to bother the old man. John carried these signs silently, the way he had carried heavy beams in his youth, but silence has its own weight. His heart grew heavier with each passing season, and the house that had once been a symbol of pride now echoed with a quiet that felt like exile. When John walked through the rooms, he sometimes traced his calloused fingers along the door frames. He remembered the nights spent sanding wood until his palms blistered, the mornings when he rose before dawn to pour cement in freezing air. He remembered saving every spare dollar to buy materials, skimping on vacations and luxuries so that David would have something permanent, something unshakable. Yet here he was, shuffling through hallways like an intruder, careful not to step on the nerves of the young couple who no longer saw him as family but as burden. The neighborhood around them had changed as well. Naperville, once a quiet suburb where everyone knew each other, had grown busier, wealthier, more polished. Shiny cars lined the driveways and manicured lawns showcased a new standard of suburban competition. John didn't care for any of that. He still drove his old Ford pickup, wore flannel shirts patched at the elbows, and spent his free time whittling small wooden crosses in the garage. But he felt the gap widening, not just between himself and the world but between himself and his own blood. He was not bitter by nature. His years as a builder and his time in Vietnam had taught him endurance, patience, and a certain stoicism. But sitting at the kitchen table one evening, listening to Monica discuss vacation plans without acknowledging him, John felt something shift. It was as if his existence had been reduced to a shadow moving around the edges of their comfortable life. He swallowed the bitterness like he once swallowed dust at construction sites, quietly with no complaint, but deep down he knew that shadows eventually fade, and perhaps that was what they wanted for him, to fade. Yet John's sense of pride did not allow him to surrender so easily. Every morning he rose before sunrise, brewed coffee, and sat on the porch watching the neighborhood wake up. To anyone passing by, he looked like a typical old man clinging to his routines. But within him a storm brewed. He began thinking more often about his late wife, Margaret, who had passed away a decade earlier. She had always been the bridge between him and David, softening the rough edges of father and son. Without her, the distance had turned into a chasm. John wished he could hear her voice again, reminding him that families stumble but endure. Yet each day proved that some families don't endure, they fracture. As the winds grew colder that autumn, John sensed that change was coming though he could not yet name it. The house that had once been his pride was becoming a cage, and the people he had built it for were slowly pushing him toward the edge. He sat there, staring at the front yard, at the withered leaves piling up against the steps, knowing that storms don't warn before they break. And this storm would come not from the skies but from within his own bloodline. The tension that John had felt in the air finally broke on a sharp November evening. The sun had set early, leaving only the faint orange glow of street lamps spilling across the neighborhood. He was in the living room, tracing the grain of the oak coffee table he had built decades earlier, when David entered with an expression that carried none of the warmth a son should have for his father. Monica hovered behind him, arms folded, her sharp eyes reflecting impatience. There were no raised voices at first, only a cool announcement that cut sharper than any scream: it was time for him to move out. John had half expected it, but hearing the words aloud was different. The man who had once been a boy running barefoot across half-finished floors was now telling him that the house had no room for its own builder. Monica's gaze confirmed that this was not a sudden decision. It had been discussed, rehearsed, and now presented as a verdict. John sat still, listening, his hands clasped on the table. He said little, only nodded slightly, but his silence was not submission. It was the silence of a man who carried more years of labor and patience than either of them could understand. The days that followed were a blur of small humiliations. John noticed his belongings slowly gathered and placed into boxes, as if he were a tenant who had overstayed his welcome. His books, his war medals, his late wife's photo frames, all stacked neatly but without reverence. The shed where he had kept his tools was locked one morning, the key mysteriously misplaced. Meals were cooked without setting a plate for him. Even the grandchildren, once eager to listen to his stories about construction sites in old Chicago, now seemed distant, as if warned to keep their affection measured. John bore it all without open protest, carrying himself with the dignity of a man who knew that losing temper meant losing ground. What David and Monica didn't know, and what John guarded carefully, was that he had never truly surrendered the house. Years ago, when he signed the transfer papers to give David ownership, a lawyer friend from church had suggested a condition. John insisted that his right to reside in the house for life be written into the agreement. It had seemed like a mere precaution at the time, almost unnecessary. After all, who imagines their own son turning them out? Yet John, shaped by years of construction contracts and disputes, knew that paper protected where words could fail. And so, tucked away in a metal box beneath the false bottom of his dresser, was the document that carried his safeguard. Still, knowing that he had legal ground did not soften the sting of betrayal. The pain was not about walls or roofs, it was about blood. Fathers raise sons not with the expectation of repayment but with the hope of respect. To be cast aside as an obstacle was a wound deeper than age or illness could inflict. Each night John lay awake, listening to the muffled laughter from the upstairs bedrooms, feeling the ache of exclusion. He often thought of Margaret, and how she would have marched straight into that kitchen, scolding both David and Monica until they blushed with shame. But Margaret was gone, and John had only his quiet strength left. The neighbors began to notice. Naperville was not the kind of place where secrets stayed hidden for long. Mrs. Jefferson, a retired schoolteacher next door, once saw John sitting outside on the porch in the cold evening air, his coat wrapped tightly around him. She asked if everything was all right and John simply smiled, but she knew. Mr. Alvarez across the street, himself a retired carpenter, stopped by and offered help if John ever needed it. Word spread quietly that something wasn't right in the Miller household. In communities where most residents were around John's age, people recognized the signs of generational conflict, and sympathy began to gather on John's side without him asking for it. Despite the whispers, David and Monica seemed unbothered. David, dressed in his tailored suits, drove his Tesla with pride and spoke at length about promotions. Monica displayed her curated life on social media, posting photos of family dinners where John's empty chair was cropped out of the frame. They lived as if John's presence were already erased, a mere inconvenience waiting for removal. But beneath John's calm exterior, resolve was hardening. He knew he could not fight them with anger. He had to fight them with the same patience and precision with which he once laid foundations. One particularly cold morning, when frost clung stubbornly to the windows, David handed John a list of senior living facilities. The pamphlets were glossy, filled with images of smiling retirees playing cards or gardening. John studied them silently, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. He folded the pamphlets neatly, placed them on the table, and walked back to his room. That evening he opened the metal box, retrieved the old agreement, and reread the clause his lawyer had insisted upon. The words were simple, clear, and unyielding. John Miller retained the right to live in the property for the rest of his natural life. Reading those lines brought no joy, only grim affirmation. He didn't want a battle, but the battle had come to him. His son's ambition, his daughter-in-law's coldness, had pushed him toward a choice he never wanted to make. He whispered to himself, not as a threat but as a vow, that he would not be erased from the very walls he had raised. He tucked the document back into its hiding place, knowing that the time would come when he would need to bring it into the light. Winter was settling in, and with it the storm inside the Miller household was reaching its peak. John carried himself with quiet composure, but beneath that calm lay the steady heartbeat of a man preparing for the hardest confrontation of his life. Not with strangers, not with bureaucrats, but with his own blood. The silence that had once been endurance was now strategy, and soon it would break into action. The day John finally left the house was colder than he had expected for early December. A wind swept through Naperville's quiet streets, rattling the bare branches that lined the sidewalks. He stood at the curb with a battered suitcase in one hand and a cardboard box balanced against his hip. Behind him, the house loomed as both monument and betrayal, its siding and roof shingles bearing his handiwork, while the people inside treated him like an unwanted relic. The door had closed with a finality that echoed in his chest, and he did not knock again. He walked slowly down the block until the glow of the porch lights vanished behind him. He checked into a small motel on Ogden Avenue, the kind of place built in the 70s and only half renovated since. The lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the clerk barely looked up as John signed the register. The room was modest: a thin carpet, a squeaky bed, and a heater that groaned with every burst of air. He set his box on the dresser and sat down on the bed, staring at the faded curtains. For the first time since Margaret's passing, he felt truly alone, not just in spirit but in space. The loneliness settled like a heavy coat around his shoulders. The following morning he sat with a styrofoam cup of motel coffee, staring at the parking lot, when he noticed Gloria Jenkins passing by. She lived a block away from his old house, a tall African-American woman in her 70s with a posture that carried authority. She had taught at the local high school for decades, shaping generations of children with discipline and warmth. Gloria paused, surprised to see him outside the motel, and approached with concern. Her questions were gentle, but her eyes were sharp enough to read between his restrained answers. John admitted only that he was taking some time away from the house, but Gloria, sensing the truth, pressed her hand on his shoulder and told him to come by if he ever needed someone to talk to. Her quiet support became an anchor in the days that followed. John knew, however, that companionship would not resolve the injustice. Each night he opened the drawer of the motel nightstand, where he had placed the folder holding his documents. He unfolded the contract again and again, his calloused fingers tracing the clause that guaranteed him residence for life. The words were unambiguous, written in clean legal language. He thought about the lawyer from his church who had insisted on it, a man who had passed away years earlier, and wondered if the foresight had been divine providence rather than mere caution. By the end of the week, John visited a law office downtown. The building was modern, glass reflecting the gray sky, a stark contrast to the brick houses he had spent his life repairing. Inside, he was greeted by a young associate who listened politely but without much interest. When John presented the contract, the young man's expression shifted from indifference to attention. He left the room to consult with a senior partner, who entered minutes later, shook John's hand firmly, and assured him that his case was not only valid but strong. They explained the process: filing a claim, presenting evidence, calling witnesses if necessary. John listened carefully, nodding, the weight of possibility pressing against the ache of betrayal. The nights in the motel grew longer, but now they were filled with a sense of direction. John began to keep notes in a small notebook, writing down every detail of his years in the house, every repair, every gathering, every neighbor who could testify that he had always been a permanent resident. He listed names: Gloria Jenkins, Mr. Alvarez, Mrs. Jefferson, even the postman who had delivered his mail to that address for decades. He thought about the photographs in his box, images of him hammering nails into the frame, of Margaret painting the front door, of David as a boy sitting on the steps with a popsicle. Each picture, he realized, was not just a memory but potential evidence. When Gloria learned of his decision to take the matter to court, she didn't hesitate. She told him she would stand beside him and tell the truth. Others followed suit. Mr. Alvarez offered his testimony about seeing John in the yard almost every day since the house was built. Mrs. Jefferson recalled borrowing tools from him countless times. Even the mailman agreed to write a statement verifying that John had received mail there for decades. Slowly, a small community rallied around him, not because he had asked, but because they recognized an injustice that mirrored fears many of them carried themselves. The lawsuit was filed before Christmas, casting a long shadow over the holiday season. John spent Christmas Eve alone in his motel room, the faint glow of colored lights from a nearby diner blinking through his curtains. He thought of years when Margaret had roasted a turkey, when David had opened gifts beneath the tree, when laughter had filled the living room he built. The contrast was almost unbearable. Yet he clung to the knowledge that the fight was no longer about sentiment, it was about principle, about dignity, about the right of an old man not to be discarded. January arrived with biting winds and heavy snow. John dressed in his only good suit, a navy wool blend he had worn to Margaret's funeral, and took the train downtown for his first court appearance. The courthouse was immense, filled with echoes of footsteps and murmurs of other lives in dispute. His attorney walked beside him, calm and confident, carrying the folder that held the contract. As John entered the courtroom, he spotted David and Monica across the aisle. David looked sleek, polished, as if determined to present himself as a successful homeowner defending his rights. Monica's eyes were cold, her lips pressed in disdain. For a brief moment, John almost faltered, seeing his own son positioned as his opponent. But then he straightened his back and remembered the clause, the promise written in ink that could not be erased by arrogance. The judge entered and proceedings began. John said little. His attorney spoke for him, presenting the contract as the foundation of their case. The opposing counsel attempted to downplay it, to argue technicalities, but the clarity of the wording was undeniable. The hearing was adjourned for further testimony, but the momentum was already shifting. As John left the courthouse, the winter sun briefly broke through the clouds, illuminating the steps beneath his feet. He felt both exhausted and strengthened, carrying the certainty that the struggle had only begun, but he was no longer powerless. He had chosen to fight, and the fight was now underway. The first weeks of the trial unfolded with a rhythm that seemed both deliberate and exhausting. Each day John dressed carefully, his navy suit pressed as best as he could manage, and rode the train into downtown Chicago, his hands steadying against the cold steel of the rail as the city rushed past the window. Inside the Cook County Courthouse, the air was thick with the mixture of stale coffee, legal jargon, and the quiet desperation of countless lives caught in disputes. For John, every step through those marble corridors was a reminder that his life's worth was now being measured not by the walls he had built, but by the papers that proved he had the right to remain inside them. The courtroom itself was both intimidating and strangely impersonal. High ceilings, fluorescent lights, and the American flag looming behind the bench created a sense of gravity that weighed heavily on everyone present. John sat beside his attorney, who methodically organized folders and exhibits. Across the aisle, David and Monica looked polished, their clothes immaculate, their expressions rehearsed. Monica's eyes rarely left John, a gaze sharpened by contempt, as if she were daring him to fight back. David, though outwardly calm, revealed his tension in the tapping of his fingers on the table. Witnesses were called, each bringing a fragment of John's life into the open. Gloria Jenkins was the first. She walked to the stand with quiet authority, her posture straight, her voice resonant with years of classroom discipline. She told the court of the decade she had lived next door, of seeing John work tirelessly on the house from foundation to rooftop, of witnessing him on the porch almost daily. She spoke of conversations over the fence, of times she had borrowed sugar or accepted his help with repairs, of the consistency of his presence. Her testimony painted a picture of permanence, of a man who had never been a guest in that home but its heart. Next came Mr. Alvarez, the retired carpenter. His rough hands gripped the railing of the witness stand as he explained how he and John had often shared tools, exchanged advice, and inspected each other's work. He described the shed in the backyard filled with John's equipment, evidence of a man still maintaining his craft long after others would have retired. His words underscored that John's connection to the house was not symbolic but active, a daily bond of labor and care. Even Mrs. Jefferson, with her frail voice and careful steps, contributed her testimony. She told the court of the time she had seen John mowing the lawn, shoveling snow, carrying groceries from the car. To her, it was unthinkable that anyone could consider him anything but the rightful resident. The judge listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions, while the jury members scribbled notes. The defense attempted to undermine these accounts, suggesting that neighbors' perceptions were based on familiarity rather than legal fact. They pressed Gloria on whether she had ever seen the actual ownership papers. They questioned Mr. Alvarez about the exact dates of his interactions. They tried to reduce the witness's memories to unreliable anecdotes. But the steady weight of their testimonies combined with the written contract proved difficult to shake. When it came time for John to speak, he rose slowly, his legs stiff but his back unbent. He spoke sparingly, each sentence deliberate. He explained how he had built the house not for himself but for the continuation of his family. He described the years of construction, the sacrifices made, the joy of finally giving his son a roof that would shelter generations. Then he explained the decision to include the clause in the contract, not out of distrust but out of a builder's habit of ensuring every structure had reinforcement. His voice did not waver, but beneath the restraint was the pain of a father forced to defend his right to exist in his own creation. David's testimony revealed the cracks in his composure. He portrayed himself as a responsible homeowner burdened by the inconvenience of an aging father. He insisted the house was legally his, that John had gifted it willingly, and that living together had become unsustainable. Monica's words were sharper, framing John as stubborn and uncooperative, suggesting that his presence strained the household. Yet their arguments lacked the solidity of the written clause, the undeniable contract that lay in the judge's hands. Day after day the case unfolded, the tension in the courtroom thickening. John sat quietly, never reacting outwardly to the barbs thrown his way, while Monica's whispers to David grew more heated. The community's presence in the gallery became noticeable. Neighbors from Naperville attended sessions, filling benches with watchful eyes, a silent chorus of support. They didn't shout or wave signs, but their steady attendance lent weight to the idea that this was not simply a family squabble but a question of dignity that resonated beyond the Miller household. As the trial progressed, the defense tried one last tactic. They suggested that John had alternative housing options, that moving to a senior facility would be in his best interest, that his resistance was fueled not by necessity but by stubborn pride. The argument lingered in the air, but John's attorney countered effectively. Pride was not the issue. The issue was a man's legal and moral right to remain in the home he had built, a right enshrined in ink and reinforced by decades of presence. By the time closing arguments approached, the outcome felt less uncertain. John sat with his hands folded, the weight of the weeks pressing down but not breaking him. He thought of Margaret often during those long sessions, imagining her hand resting gently on his shoulder, reminding him to endure. He thought of the house not as property but as legacy, a vessel of memory that could not be stripped away by greed or convenience. The final words spoken in court carried the gravity of the entire case. The attorney's voice was calm yet firm as he pointed once more to the contract, to the clause that could not be erased. He reminded the court that the law existed not only to protect wealth and property but to protect fairness, to ensure that even the vulnerable had their rights honored. When the judge called the session adjourned, John exhaled slowly, knowing that the final decision was near. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, the cold Chicago air hit his face like a cleansing wind. He paused on the steps, staring at the gray sky above the skyscrapers. The battle was not yet won, but for the first time in months he felt the balance of justice shifting. The house he had built with his own hands was no longer slipping away into the hands of arrogance and ingratitude. It was becoming what it had always been, the anchor of his life and the symbol of his endurance. The final day of the trial arrived with a heaviness that settled over the courthouse like an early morning fog. John sat quietly in the pew outside the courtroom, his hands clasped together, his knuckles pale against the dark fabric of his suit. He could feel every second stretch out, as though time itself were testing his patience one last time. Around him, neighbors whispered in subdued tones, their presence a steady reminder that he was not standing alone. Gloria Jenkins had come again, sitting upright with her hands folded over her purse, her eyes sharp and unwavering. Mr. Alvarez nodded respectfully as John passed, and even frail Mrs. Jefferson had insisted on being wheeled into the gallery, wrapped in a thick shawl. Their silent solidarity felt like a protective wall around him. Inside, the air was taut with anticipation. The judge entered, her robe trailing as she took her seat, and the bailiff called the room to order. The jury filed in, each face unreadable, carrying the weight of days of testimony, arguments and legal intricacies. John drew a deep breath, steadying himself as his attorney leaned over with a quiet reassurance. The moment was no longer in his hands. The foreperson of the jury rose, holding the folded verdict slip with a composure that betrayed nothing of the decision within. John's heart pounded in his chest as the words were read aloud. The jury had found in his favor. The clause in the contract granting him lifetime residence was valid, binding, and indisputable. The house was not merely his son's to dispose of at will. John's right to remain was upheld, and the court ordered David and Monica to compensate him for the distress caused by their unlawful attempt to evict him. For a moment the courtroom was silent, as though no one had fully processed what had just been declared. Then the sound of shifting benches, muffled gasps, and the quiet murmurs of relief filled the space. Gloria closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks under her breath. Mr. Alvarez let out a low sigh, nodding as if justice had built itself brick by brick in front of them all. John remained seated, motionless, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table in front of him. He felt no triumphal surge, no burst of gloating satisfaction. Instead, a deep, weary calm settled over him. He had not fought to win power or humiliate his son. He had fought to preserve dignity, to keep the promise he had made to himself when he laid the foundation of that house with his bare hands. Justice had not made him younger or less tired, but it had restored something precious he feared was lost, the recognition that his life still had value. Across the aisle, David's face was a portrait of disbelief. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted toward Monica as if searching for reassurance, but her expression had hardened into something distant. She gathered her purse with sharp movements, her lips pressed thin, her body angled away from him. The rift that had begun as whispers behind closed doors now stretched out into the open, undeniable in front of the entire room. David lowered his head, the arrogance that had once carried him into this battle draining away, replaced by a hollow shame he could not disguise. The judge delivered a closing admonition, her words measured but firm. She reminded everyone that family was not a battleground for greed and ambition, that the law existed not only to protect property but to honor commitments. Her voice carried an authority that pierced through the lingering tension, and then the gavel struck, ending the case. Outside the courthouse, the cold Chicago wind rushed through the streets, carrying with it the noise of traffic and the bustle of daily life. John stepped down the stone steps slowly, the weight of the verdict pressing on him in an almost surreal way. Gloria approached and placed a gentle hand on his arm. She did not need to say anything, her eyes conveyed everything. Mr. Alvarez gave him a firm nod of respect, and even Mrs. Jefferson, bundled tightly in her wheelchair, managed a small smile. These neighbors had been his quiet army, and their presence had made all the difference. David followed behind, his movements stiff, his gaze fixed on the pavement. Monica walked several steps ahead of him, her heels clicking sharply against the stone, her shoulders stiff. The silence between them was louder than any argument could have been. John watched them for a moment, not with hatred but with a weary sadness. He had once carried his son on his shoulders, had dreamed of a future where the house would be filled with laughter and grandchildren. That dream had been shattered not by strangers but by the selfishness of the very people he had built it for. Returning home was both comforting and haunting. The familiar creak of the front steps, the scent of wood that still lingered in the beams, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, it all felt like an embrace. Yet as John unlocked the door and stepped inside, he could not ignore the emptiness. The house was his sanctuary once more, but it was also a reminder of what had been lost. He moved slowly through each room, his hand brushing over the furniture, the walls, the photographs that still adorned the shelves. In the living room, Margaret's portrait looked down at him, her smile frozen in time, her eyes reflecting a warmth that steadied him. That night he sat by the fireplace, the flames casting shadows across the room. The house was quiet but not silent. It breathed with the memories of years past, and now it carried the weight of his victory. He poured himself a modest glass of whiskey, lifting it in a silent toast to the journey he had endured. He thought of the jury who had seen the truth, of the neighbors who had stood by him, of the strength he had drawn from every nail and beam he had set into place decades earlier. There was no need for grand celebrations or proclamations. The triumph was in the simplicity of being able to sit in his own chair, in his own home, knowing that his dignity had not been erased. His life had been tested, his love betrayed, but he had endured. The law had affirmed what his heart already knew, that no one could strip away the worth of a man who had built with his own hands, who had lived with integrity, who had fought quietly but firmly for what was right. As the night deepened and the flames burned lower, John leaned back, letting the warmth wash over him. He was not naive. He knew wounds would remain, that reconciliation with his son might never come. But there was peace in knowing that he had not been defeated, that his story had not ended with exile and humiliation. Instead, it had ended with a return, a vindication, and a lesson carved deeply into the walls of his home. Some victories are not loud but they last a lifetime. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.